In the early 1960s, a linguistics professor at Oxford by the name of J.R.R. Tolkien discovered that he was being robbed. A decade earlier, he had published a book that he had been writing for years, tinkering with really, called The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien wanted to write a national myth for English peoples, which he felt was bereft from his native culture. You might say, hey, what about King Arthur and all that? Here's the thing. King Arthur's not English. King Arthur is British. There is a difference. King Arthur is kind of a mix between Welsh and French traditions, but there was nothing that was truly English, truly Anglo-Saxon. When Tolkien finally published The Lord of the Rings, critics at the time were confused that this acclaimed academic was writing about orcs and dwarves and whatnot. They thought, like, couldn't he be doing something better? Like, what is this story for babies? Over the years, The Lord of the Rings started to take on a life of its own when people read the book for themselves and they discovered its magic. Tolkien discovered that his 3 books, well, it was really written as one book, but split into 3 volumes, as we all know clearly. The Lord of the Rings was only published in the United Kingdom, right? And so Tolkien discovered that an American publisher named Ace Books had been selling bootleg copies of The Lord of the Rings over in the States. And Tolkien said, what? And they said, hey man, you never copyrighted it in America, so it's public domain. Sorry. And this pissed Tolkien off because Tolkien loved his art, his literature, but he also loved money. I mean, in the same way that all human beings love money, love being compensated for the work that they do. So he led a campaign that basically led to such negative backlash against Ace Books that they stopped publishing these illegal copies where Tolkien would get no royalties from it. And so, in 1965, Tolkien teamed up with Ballantine Books to release the first official edition of The Lord of the Rings. Now, for the first time, Americans could read the story of Bilbo and Gandalf and Aragorn. This ended up being a smash hit. Can you believe it? All these hippies and college students in the late 1960s really grasped onto the environmentalist and anti-war themes of The Lord of the Rings as being pretty revolutionary, as something that spoke to them in a way that a lot of earlier literature did not. Actually, fun fact, the Beatles even wanted to remake The Lord of the Rings. They wanted to make the first live-action adaptation where each of the 4 would play the hobbits. And I think Tolkien's response was, cool, if you give me a lot of money, I'm fine with it. The smash popularity of The Lord of the Rings led to Ballantine Books looking for more fantasy that they could publish. For the first time, there was a market for fantasy novels outside of the space of children, you know, outside of The Wizard of Oz and Alice in Wonderland. So Lynn Carter, the editor at Ballantine Books, who would end up seeing this initiative, would dig up Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast and The Worm Ouroboros by E.R. Edison, and these sold decently enough as well. It's really funny that, you know, on this copy of The Worm Ouroboros, an epic fantasy to compare with Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, a literary event of the first importance. You know, this book came out 3 decades before Lord of the Rings. You know, they had to get Lord of the Rings readers to read this book. They had to be like, hey, this is also like Lord of the Rings. Please read it. And it works. That's what they do to this very day. You know, anytime they want anyone to read a fantasy book or any work of speculative fiction, they say, guys, this is written just like Lord of the Rings and Dune. Can you believe it? This initiative of republishing older fantasy novels was so successful that it became an official imprint of Ballantine books called Ballantine Adult Fantasy. Lynn Carter found books like The King of Elflin's Daughter by Lord Dunsany. Oh my goodness, look at this beautiful cover. I could get lost in these covers all day. That's why I collect these books. I tricked you. This is a video where I can just show off all my 1970s Ballantine editions. We have Ballantine Adult Fantasy, and you can tell a Ballantine Adult Fantasy by the unicorn on the front or the back. And over the next 5 years, from 1970 through 1974, Ballantine would republish basically every single work of fantasy that had ever been written up until that point, in a initiative to prove that, hey, fantasy isn't just for kids, because they had to convince people of that. In order to fill the insatiable need for more classic books, Lynn Carter looked in more and more obscure places. And to be fair for him, by doing so, he sort of ends up creating the finest curation of fantasy novels that anyone has ever done, ever, frankly. And so he finds this little novel that was published in 1936, 1 year before The Hobbit. It was called The Virgin and the Swine. It was written by a woman named Evangeline Walton. Her real name was Evangeline Wilna Ensley. She retold one of the branches from the national epic of Wales called the Mabinogion. She retold the fourth branch, Math Fab Mathanwy, Math son of Mathanwy. Her objective with this book was to take this mythological tale that is filled with violence and incest and all of these other really dark themes, which are totally alien to the modern reader. And she wanted to tell the story with full psychological realism. Because when you're reading mythology, people can make irrational decisions and you say, that's okay. It's just a story. It doesn't have to make sense. It's fairy tale logic. But Evangeline Walton said, no. How would real human beings, albeit in an ancient world filled with magic and monsters, how would they think, how would they behave to get them into these absolutely bug nut situations? And so she wrote The Virgin and the Swine, which I count as one of the very first works of epic fantasy, published 1 full year before The Hobbit, mind you. And importantly, the first work of epic fantasy ever written by a woman 2 decades before The Lord of the Rings. So imagine Lynn Carter reading through this book, being absolutely shocked at how dark this story was, and thinking, I have to contact this woman. I have to contact her state. So he finds a phone number, he calls it up, and he says, hey, I'm Lynn Carter from Ballantine Books. I would really love if we could publish this book from 40 years ago. And we know Evangeline Walton is probably passed away, but whichever son or daughter is still alive in the house, would you mind if we published your mother's work? And instead they got Evangeline Walton, who was still very much alive and kicking. And she says, oh, you want to republish that book? Well, I've written the rest of the series in the decades since then. Do you want to publish those too? And so Lynn Carter got 4 books for the price of 1. And thus we get, this was such a long intro, but I think I did it well. We got the Mabinogion Quartet, Prince of Annwn, Children of Llyr, the Song of Rhiannon, and finally The Island of the Mighty, which is a retitled Virgin and the Swine, because they were, they kind of realized that part of the reason why Virgin and the Swine didn't do so well back in the 1930s was because Its title is very sus, right? It even says here, formerly The Virgin and the Swine. And so, what we got in the early 1970s was one of the best fantasy series ever written. It blows my mind that people aren't talking about this more. I read these books a few months ago and they left such a impression on me that I am talking about them now. These books were very popular in the 1970s. If you talk to old heads, like people in their 50s or whatever, they'll say, yes, the Mabinogion Quartet. Excellent books. Anyone should read them. But okay, just go to YouTube right now, search, Mabinogion Evangeline Walton. The only result you get, the only person on YouTube who has ever talked about these books, ever, is, drumroll please, former teen literary wunderkind, Christopher Paolini, the lights camera Jackson of literature. Okay, that's really mean. No, but he has this 2-minute video where he praises the Mabinogion Quartet for just being like one of the best written fantasy series ever crafted.
She creates wonderful moods and is very, very evocative with the other world, the fairyland that her characters end up getting pulled into.
What is the series and why has it languished in relative obscurity for so long? Hopefully I will be able to answer at least one of those questions. First, let's talk about what the Mabinogion is. The Mabinogion is the closest of what we have to a compendium of Welsh mythology that exists today. However, the thing to keep in mind is that the culture of ancient Wales was predominantly oral, right? You have all these druids keeping legends and whatnot. So a lot of these stories from ancient Welsh mythology are lost today, which I assume has only led to certain people assuming that, like, oh, Wales doesn't have much of a culture besides this one book. But that's not really the case. It's just there's so many stories that they probably had that just didn't survive to the modern day. The whole reason why we have the Mabinogion as it exists, I'm going to pull out, this is a library copy. This is the Penguin Classics edition, translated by Jeffrey Gantz. As I said, I read the Quartet a few months ago, and so I'm just like reading through the original stories, both so that I can compare and contrast for this video, but also so that I, have a refresher on the names of the different characters. But a few centuries ago, a document called the Red Book of Hengist was uncovered, and this compilation of Welsh prose and poetry has basically everything that exists in the modern day Mabinogion. The Mabinogion consists of primarily the 4 branches: the tale of Pwyll, Prince of Dyfed, the tale of Bronwyn, son of Llyr, the tale of Manawydan, son of Llyr, and then the tale of Math, son of Mathonwy. And those are sort of the 4 central tales of Welsh mythology. And the current compendium known as the Mabinogion has those 4 tales, but it also has lots of miscellaneous romances and stories. Many of them are seen as precursors to the King Arthur myth, so those are fascinating as well. They were compiled into English for the first time, I think, by Lady Charlotte Guest, who lived in the early 19th century. So having the Mabinogion translated into English was relatively novel. It had only existed for a few decades when Evangeline Walton was born, and that was the version that she would have been using. Charlotte Guest's version is renowned for its poetic prose. The version I read is much more to the point, much more accurate, right? Less flowery in the Victorian way, but I see a lot of people, like a lot of mid-20th century fantasy authors, cite Charlotte Guest as being very inspirational to their prose, of course Evangeline Walton being one of them. So the interesting thing about the four branches of the Mabinogion is they all take place in the same universe. I hate to use that kind of Marvel brain terminology, but the four parts all share different characters in themes, but it's not one contiguous story. In fact, you only have one character who appears in all four of them, this guy named Pryderi, who is the son of the protagonist of the first story, who is kind of like a minor character in the second, a major character in the third, and an antagonist in the fourth. So he takes on these different roles. He's like always in the background, and you kind of get his story, which leads a lot of scholars to suspect, oh, perhaps the original version of the Mabinogion was like centered around him. But again, we're getting this written down medieval copy of an oral tradition that has been so changed and warped over the years. There is like lots of disparity between the different parts, right? So it doesn't really gel together, which actually allows me to transition to another thing I wanted to mention: Tolkien's love-hate relationship with it. Because if you look at what Tolkien is working with, what he's citing for The Lord of the Rings, he is predominantly working from the Icelandic Eddas, from the German sagas, from the Finnish Kalevala, but he is very intentionally not drawing from Celtic mythology. And there's lots of debate about why this is. Part of it is, as I said earlier, he's trying to make an Anglo-Saxon mythology when British mythology is already so defined by its Welsh elements. So he is rejecting everything Welsh so that he can make his own thing. And to be clear, he loved the Welsh language, but he's very intentionally not using any of the culture or the mythology, because as he wrote in a letter, he said he didn't like Celtic mythology because he says something like, oh, it's like a broken stained glass window where you hold up the shards and there's like these strong bits of color, but it doesn't fit together. As I said before, you can explain that by this being an oral tradition that we only have fragments of, and then everything we know about Welsh mythology today is by scholars trying to like fill in the gaps. But it's also because Tolkien was super, let's say, particular about world building. You know, C.S. Lewis would show him the Chronicles of Narnia, and Tolkien would be like, this doesn't make any sense. Why do you have satyrs and dwarves in the same setting? Those are from two different mythologies. That doesn't make sense. Your world building doesn't make sense, and you're dumb, Clive Staples. And Clive's like, oh, well, you're my, I think your books are good, Tolkien. And Tolkien's like, well, your books are terrible. It's actually, you can look into this, just like how often Tolkien just shits all over Clive Staples. I wrote, I guess this is how Clive Staples sounds now. It's like, Tolkien, I wrote a science fiction book called That Hideous Strength. And Tolkien reads it and he's like, more like That Hideous Book. It's so rude. Nevertheless, despite the fact that Tolkien isn't really willing to use cultural elements from the Mabinogion, he is still nevertheless influenced by it. You mostly see it in the fact that the metatextual explanation for the existence of The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, and the Silmarillion is that the conceit is that Tolkien found them all in a book that Bilbo, Frodo, and Sam wrote together called the Red Book of Westmarch, and Tolkien translated that book into modern English, just like how the Mabinogion comes from the Red Book of Hengist. I forgot it, whatever, but you know what I'm talking about. And also just the very structure of the Silmarillion, which is to say all these different stories that meld disparate sources that go together, also comes from the Mabinogion. You do have other authors who do use the Mabinogion as their primary inspiration. There's actually one who predates Evangeline Walton, a guy named Kenneth Morris, which can either be spelled normal or Welsh as hell, depending on what edition you're reading. He wrote a book in, I think, the 1910s called The Fates of the Princes of Dyfed, which kind of remixes elements of the Mabinogion and tells them out of order, while Evangeline Walton elected to tell all four of the branches, one book each, straight. And I'll get into her method in a little bit. The most famous remix of the Mabinogion is the Lloyd Alexander Prydain series. I grew up reading these books. I grew up reading the Book of Three, the Black Cauldron. Actually, speaking of which, these are basically the editions I grew up with. You have the classic art of the Horned King right now, but then you go to the Black Cauldron and it's the tie-in Disney version before going back to the beautiful painted art for the rest of them. What Lloyd Alexander did in the Chronicles of Prydain is he takes elements from the Mabinogion, like the Black Cauldron or a soothsaying pig, and he uses that to craft an original story. And of course, who doesn't forget all of the different names, like Fluterflam and Princess Eilonwy, who is the single best Disney princess, and if anyone disagrees with me, I will fight them. And of course, the most divinely annoying character in all of fiction, Gurgi. I could make this entire video talking about Gurgi, doing the voice. I've practiced the voice a lot. You don't you don't want to hear me do the voice. It would send the entire video off the rails, so I will not. Now that we have an establishing of what the Mabinogion is, what's peculiar about these four books, each one of them based off of one of the four branches of the Mabinogion, basically expanding each of the branches from a 15-page story to a 150 to 300 page full-length book. These are beautifully paced novels. Evangeline Walton fills in the gaps of the narrative. You're reading the original stories and, you jump a paragraph and years go by, right? And she is able to flesh it all out to make each of these a full, coherent narrative. She wrote these books backwards because The Virgin and the Swine, aka Island of the Mighty, is the last, both in order and chronology, of the Mabinogion. And I'm supposing that she probably wrote this one first because it's the most juicy. It's the most messed up. It is like one of the weirdest, darkest books I've ever read. I read the original version and she's not changing anything. The whole point is that she is maintaining every single plot beat that's in the original stories, but she's fleshing them out, giving them psychological depth so that they make sense. She publishes this. It gets a positive reception from critics, even though they think it's like weird and depressing and dark and depraved, and it doesn't sell very well. So Evangeline Walton is discouraged, naturally, but John Cowper Powys, who is one of the great Welsh scholars and novelists of the early to mid 20th century, reads the book and he says, hey, you're an American, but you're doing an incredible justice to Welsh mythology and Welsh culture. You should keep it up, even if people didn't really read your book at all. And so she does. She's written the book based off of the fourth branch, and she writes a follow-up book called The Brothers of Bronwyn, which adapts the second and third branches together, and she is about to get it published in 1940. The publishers pull out at the last minute. There's a paper shortage due to World War II. The first book was weird and dark and no one liked it. I mean, critics, like, I keep saying this over and over again, but it didn't sell at all. And then three, it was 180,000 words. And just like with Tolkien, the publishers were like, 180,000 words? That's so long. No one will ever be able to read a book that's as long as that bad boy. To fill you in on the joke, one Brandon Sanderson is at least 200,000 words, right? There is like no best-selling epic fantasy novels that aren't at least 200,000 words. And the Brando Sandos easily go up to, they're now up to 450K. That's like the 3 times the length of what this novel would have been. But basically they pull out. Just when she thinks he's in, they pull out. That's discouraging for her. But she keeps writing. Throughout the 1940s, she writes a trilogy of novels about Theseus. That starts with an Amazon-based book. She's gonna try to get it published, but then Mary Renault comes out with her beloved duology, The King Must Die and The Bull from the Sea. These get like so much critical and popular attention that it dissuades her from trying to publish her own trilogy because these basically took up the whole market space for them. This is probably like her most famous book outside of the Mabinogion Quartet. She is able to get this published. This is her second book published a full 20 years after The Virgin and the Swine. Witch House, which is I haven't read it yet. I want to read it. Look, it's Witch House. Look, there's a witch and she's in a house and there's this little Victorian child who's like, "Oh golly, please don't eat me. Oh, it's a witch house." And everlasting horror proclaims the back. The little girl saw it, saw the evil that had been bequeathed by her house that had bedeviled her ancestors. This really seems like it's a predecessor to Haunting of Hill House, doesn't it? I shouldn't be laughing at this in the year 2025. We are a full, nearly 3 decades now after Meet the Parents, but the protagonist of this book is named Dr. Gaylord Carew. Awesome name, dude. I love it. So I hope to read this soon. She writes another book in, I think, this might have come out in the late 40s, I think. Actually, I can check it right now. I can use my human eyes. Okay, I messed up. This came out 1 decade later. This gets published in 1945. And then she has a second book, which is a lot more obscure, called The Sword and the Cross, which might be about Crusaders or something. That's the one that's hardest to find information about, because it really is her most obscure work that got published in the mid-1950s. But then after that, absolutely nothing. But despite that, she kept writing. She kept writing. And then we get to the present, 1970, she gets the phone call. "Hey, we want to republish Virgin and the Swine because I actually think it's pretty good." So it comes out as The Island of the Mighty. Then the next 2 years, they split the Brothers of Bronwyn into The Children of Llyr and The Song of Rhiannon, which I think is a very smart decision because the two halves of this story, since they are based off of like 2 different branches of the Mabinogion, but these are like the 2 most opposite books in terms of tone. I think it would have been kind of like a disastrous clash had they been one narrative. And so after these 3 books come out and they're like huge hits, Lynn Carter says, "Hey, do you want to just like finish it all up?" And so in like 1973 or whatever, just again, 4 decades after she started writing this series, she wrote The Prince of Annwn, based off of the first branch, in order to wrap up the whole cycle, bring it to a close. And what's so interesting about the fact that she wrote this whole series backwards is she is able to presage what happens in the later books. I mean, authors foreshadow and, they do all this stuff. But because she had literally already written and published the later books, she is able to do foreshadowing a lot more effectively. And then she is able to set up its themes. And what are the themes of the Mabinogion Quartet? Besides trying to inject a historical reality and psychological realism to these mythological stories. I would say at the end of the day that this is a feminist epic about the slow degradation of women's place in the ancient world. In the first book, you are in a mythic Bronze Age matriarchal culture, complete with like mother goddesses and all powerful women and whatnot. And their place, the place of women, slowly degrades over time until you get to the cruel Iron Age hyper-patriarchal war societies of Island of the Mighty. It's interesting that I call this a feminist epic because for a lot of people, for a lot of different reasons, feminist is a loaded term, even though, it shouldn't be, but whatever. I feel like when people say feminist fantasy or feminist literature as a whole, it actually means two very opposite things, right? It can either mean affirming literature of like, oh man, isn't it great to be a girl, be a woman, to have femininity, to be able to have that power? And then the other, stuff you could call feminine literature is like, isn't it a really rough lot to be a woman? And so the reason why I'm disclaiming that is when you say like feminist fantasy literature, you kind of think of something. I got it right here. You kind of think of like something like The Sheep Farmer's Daughter, the Deed of Paxenarian, where it's like, hey, a girl can be a knight. A girl can be badass and do action and whatnot. Or you think of like the 90s young adult fantasy of Tamara Pierce. But because you have some of the most powerful women in mythology, even though you have these individual cases like maybe one of the most powerful feminine characters in all of ancient mythology, Rhiannon, as an example, their individual might isn't able to protect the overall place of women degrading as a whole throughout the society. And so that's why I think it's feminist, is because it explores the historical and sociological reasons why patriarchy comes around. At the beginning of the Quartet, what is commonly understood, this doesn't really get brought up in the first book. It sort of becomes more and more relevant in the second book onwards. But it is understood that a woman has a free right to choose who her partners are, even if she is married. Women are allowed to be polyamorous in this sort of ancient Celtic society. The understanding is like, even if you're married to a woman, like it's not your place to dictate who she loves. And because of this, you have this fascinating quirk of how lineage gets passed down, of how kingship gets passed down. Because you're a king, right? And you have a son. But because your wife is allowed to be with whoever she chooses, there is no absolute guarantee that your son is biologically yours. So kingship gets passed down through your sister's sons to your nephews, because your sister is related to you. You came from the same mom, and you know that your sister's kids are her kids because they came out of her. Slowly you have these rumblings of men in positions of power who want to be able to create lineages. They want to create dynasties. And so they come up with these increasingly advanced schemes for how do I ensure that my child is by a certain mind. It goes to its natural darkest conclusions in multiple ways in the final book, in Island of the Mighty. So that is like the general schema, even though with this long tangent about the feminism I believe to be implicit in this series, it is still, at the end of the day, a series which mostly has male protagonists, because Evangeline Walton is, again, preserving the literal point-for-point mythology of the original stories. She is able to expand the feminine characters who might be one note otherwise, and make them thinking, feeling human beings with sensible motivations. Anyway, let me get to the actual books now. I'm going to recount all of them in order. Well, one of the many things I find so lovely about this series, besides the complexity of its themes, the beauty of its prose, and so forth, is how radically different each of the 4 books are. The first, Prince of Annwn, is a heroic, mythic quest fantasy. And I want to quickly shout out the cover art by, I always forget his name, David McCall Johnston. What's interesting about these books is in the different editions, they flip the front art and the back art. It's less apparent on this one because this back art is, it's whatever, but you'll see on the other books that both sides of the cover make an equally good front cover. And so you see different editions which have both sides as the front cover, which is fascinating. But the Prince of Annwn opens up with Pwyll, Prince of Dyfed. And one day he is approached by Death, who is literally a guy on a gray horse. And he says, hey, you were a little rude to me earlier. You didn't realize it, but you were rude to me, and I'm Death. So I'm going to ask a favor of you. I am warring with another king of death, and that makes you think, wait, there's multiple kings of death in the realm of the dead. They also have feudal societies. That's mind-blowing. I'm warring with the king of death, but I can't kill him myself because we're of like the same undead substance. So I need you to take my place and kill death for me. This is the most expanded of the 4 novels, partially because some of the content of the original branch, Evangeline Walton put in later books as flashback material. So this already has like a slimmer amount of material to work with. And in the second half, he romances the most famous character from not just the Mabinogion, but Welsh mythology, Rhiannon of the birds. The Rhiannon that Fleetwood Mac wrote the song about. Rhiannon. Stevie Nicks wasn't familiar with this series. She just read the original mythology. And she thought, Rhiannon is this powerful supernatural goddess who can do anything and she can love anyone who she loves, right? And she was so moved by that she wrote the song about Rhiannon of the birds. After the fact, fans introduced her to Evangeline Walton, and she fell in love with this series. And by all accounts, she currently owns the rights to any possible film or TV adaptation. She's been trying for years to try to get an adaptation of these books off of the ground. But the only people talking about these books online are me and Christopher Paolini, the Lights Camera Jackson of fantasy literature. So we need more people singing the praises of this book. So this is a happy, light-hearted book. Well, maybe not happy, but it is heroic. It is heroic and it makes you feel good and it has a happily ever after ending. Cut to The Children of Llyr, which is a novel about why you should never trust the Irish. No, it's so funny. The people who originally told these stories, there's the us Celts of the Welsh, and then there's the them Celts, the Irish. So whenever you want to have an evil faction, you just go to the Irish instead of the Welsh. So while the first one was this mythic quest, this is a truly blood-spackled war epic where a marriage proposal that's meant to unite Wales and Ireland together goes horribly wrong, and it leads to untold amounts of bloodshed between these two peoples. Here's the back of the book. This is such a great sequence. You have this war host that is led by a set of brothers who want to rescue their sister Bronwyn from the Irish. You finally find out that Bronn, the High King of Wales, oh, by the way, he's been 80 feet tall this whole time. Like, he has to, like, wade through the sea because he's that tall. And they hadn't really mentioned it up until that point. They, like, would casually mention, like, oh, yeah, he's, like, too big to fit in a house. And you think, that's a pretty tall guy. What is he, like 9 feet tall? No, he's 80 feet tall. That's so awesome, dude. This bleak, bloody war epic that has not one, two of the most shocking acts of violence I have ever encountered in literature. One of which just made me like drop my book. I was like, oh my God, and it's so out of left field. On a similar note, if you were to read these books, I recommend you read them before you read the original stories. Because if you read the original stories, that's going to give away how crazy the plot twists are. And just like what a plot twist it was. I was like, I can't believe Evniston would do that. I can't believe he did it twice. Here's the thing. It's the same dude who keeps doing all these shocking acts of violence. Because the premise of this book, besides what if you can't trust the Irish, is what if you had a brother who was chaotic evil and he just kept doing chaotic evil things? Or, you might think, actually, he's chaotic neutral. Whatever, I don't care. What if you had a brother who is chaotic evil and you can't really do anything about him because you can't kill your own brother? That's not right. But he just keeps doing horrible things and you have to desperately try to fix things with diplomacy and with bloodshed and with a zombie-making Black Cauldron. For the Lloyd Alexander fans, the Black Cauldron is in this book, and it does all of the zombie stuff that it does in the books and the Disney movie. Keep that in mind. Next up, the Song of Rhiannon. Here we got, I don't know if that's Brannigan. That might be Manawydan. You have that, and then you have this especially beautiful back cover, which I'm gonna use as the thumbnail of the video, because this is just like one of the most gorgeous paintings I've ever seen. The Song of Rhiannon is a cozy, romantic slice of life. You have a light book, you have a very dark book, then you have a very light book of all of the characters from the first two books who are still alive and kicking. They just get married, and then they just play Stardew Valley. We just want to keep out of politics. We're going to do Stardew Valley. And you think I'm joking about that, but literally most of the book is these different characters. Finally, in this book, England exists when it didn't in the previous book. Like, now you have Anglo-Saxons who are around. And so they're like, how are we going to make our living? Let's go to a town in England and make some shields. And then they're so good at making shields that all of the local English shield makers are like, we must conspire against them. They're putting us out of business, by Jove. And so they like run them out of town and they go to a different town and it's like, we are going to make saddles now. That's how we're going to make our living. And they're just like so good at making saddles that all of the local English saddle makers are like, these Welsh are putting us out of business, by Jove. And it happens like multiple times with different towns, but they're like taking a different craft every time. And it's so fun. And there is like a plot drama that happens later on, but it ends up resolving and tying together all of the lingering plot threads from the first three books. So if you want to read this as a trilogy, you can really stop at every book. Every book is a satisfying way to end the series. Based off of what I've said previously, people might not be as invested in reading the final book, Island of the Mighty. Let's look at these different covers here. The titular character, Math, son of Mathanwy. He shows up in the previous books whenever High King Bronn is trying to muster his soldiers to go to Ireland. Oh, and also Math is there too. He's immortal, by the way, and he's a wizard. And you're like, what? What's the deal with that guy? And you don't really find out. And here you finally find out what his deal is. Which is, Math, son of Mathanwy, is an immortal psychic wizard, but hitting the T very hard. But whenever he's sitting down, he needs a virgin to be like holding his feet in her lap and like assumedly like massaging his feet and stuff at all times, or he dies. I need a virgin to hold my feet. Math has a sinister nephew. He lusts for the Virgin Gawain, who is the woman employed to hold Math's feet. It's like the greatest position in the court. But she's not having it. These nephews of Math engineer a false flag attack against characters from the previous books. They do a pig raid, which seems silly until you think about it, because the idea is like, oh, you have the descendants from the character in the first book, because he's like bros with death now, right? Because he did this whole quest in the underworld. And the Grim Reaper, the Prince of Annwn himself, says, hey, bro, we have a new tech in the underworld. It's called pigs. Like pigs didn't exist in the world before. Because we're bros, you can have pigs. Think of a world where bacon didn't exist. And then bacon suddenly existed. And everyone's like going insane. They're like, I bet that bacon tastes so good, I would murder for it. And so it leads to a lot of murder. These brothers basically engineer a war for the sake of bacon, just so that they can be alone with this woman and assault her. You have Evangeline Walton writing this and not some dude. There is much more care and sensitivity put into the assault than you would typically expect from like a Conan the Barbarian type fantasy from around this very same time. But that's still, I can understand if a lot of like modern readers find that a deeply unpleasant element, which it is, and it's supposed to be a deeply unpleasant element. Math is like, I am so sorry that you had this grievous crime and injustice done against you. I'm gonna make you queen of all the land. I'm gonna give you like absolute power in retribution. And I'm like, is this the first time that a rape survivor has gotten justice in the ancient world? I was like, oh, that's crazy. The brothers get punished in a bizarre but suitably harsh way for their crimes. Raiding for bacon leading up to an assault is maybe like the first quarter of the book. I couldn't think of any way to like describe how crazy the rest of the book got without just like spoiling the whole thing. So I'll just say that because of all these unfortunate circumstances, Math, son of Methonwy, needs a new virgin to hold his feet for him. And the consequences of just an old psychic wizard needing a virgin to hold his feet leads to a whole host of misery for everyone involved. But by the end of the book, you're just feeling empty. In a good way. Besides Gawain, the woman who is attacked by the brothers, every single character, and to be clear, we haven't even met our main protagonist yet. Every single character in this book is a huge scumbag. This is a book about hurt people hurting people, and nearly every single character gets an absolutely miserable resolution, but in a way that is like bizarrely cathartic. All these people deserve pain. You just watch them do horrible things to each other one after another. And I guess like what I'm saying is like this is basically, as far as I'm aware, the first like true grimdark novel. If that sounds fascinating, you should read that book, or if you don't like how dark that last book gets, then just read the first 3 books, and that's also perfectly fine. So anyway, I've gone through my blow by blow. This video is getting long. So what happens after these 4 books get published? Well, here's the thing. The first 3 books get published, And then in 1974, Ballantine stops the adult fantasy imprint. I don't know why this is. It's one of the great mysteries to me. There's like other people who have like done videos about Ballantine adult fantasy. Maybe I should watch those videos. Maybe I can find out for myself. But the point is, this hyper popular imprint, or at least popular for a while, started shutting down. Prince of Annwn does not have the unicorn on it. And the reason why is it's technically not a Ballantine adult fantasy because it didn't get published until after the imprint had ended. But Lynn Carter had committed to Evangeline Walton, hey, I am going to publish all 4 of your books, and I'm not going to renege on that, right? So what happened after Prince of Annwn got published? Did it lead to a huge explosion for Evangeline Walton based off of the popularity at the time of the quartet? Not really. In 1981, The Sword is Forged saw print. If you remember, this is the first of her Theseus trilogy that she had been writing all the way back in the 1940s and 50s. It finally saw print. This one is based around the Queen of the Amazons. I'm curious to read it, but at the same time, I kind of don't want to. And do you know why? They never published the rest. The other books exist, but they just didn't get made. A few years later, Evangeline Walton got diagnosed with a brain tumor. She got surgery for it. Things didn't get better, and she ended up passing away in the 1990s. Since her death, there has been one posthumous release in 2013, I believe, and one short story collection released. But there are easily at least half a dozen novels that she wrote in her lifetime that are just sitting in a vault somewhere. Absolutely unread, untouched, just due to lack of interest. She just doesn't have the fan base, I guess, to justify publishing these books in current year. And that makes me viscerally upset that one of the greatest prose stylists of the 20th century is just sitting neglected, and her legacy is shrinking with every year because the only people who remember her for the most part are the people who read her books back in the 1970s and the 1980s. There's a narrative in speculative fiction that up until quite recently, fantasy and science fiction were both giant boys' clubs, which, to be fair, in many ways they were. You read 1980s doorstopper fantasy, and it's all the same dudes over and over again who are just writing these big tomes with their sexist stereotypes and whatever, and their power fantasies. Modern authors and publishers tell the story that fantasy and sci-fi used to be boys' clubs, and only within the last 20 years are women publishing speculative fiction. You can read the most recent releases, and that's like an active praxis. You're finally fighting back against like this whole history of misogyny and sexism in fantasy. But what that does is that erases the strong history of women writing fantasy and science fiction all throughout the 20th century and even before the 20th century. If you just like look at the stats, if you just like look at who was writing like what in every year throughout, especially throughout the second half of the 20th century, women were constantly writing the most interesting and dynamic fantasy there was. And yet all of those different authors and all of those different legacies are forgotten in preference to the next big thing. If you go to a modern Barnes and Noble, the only 20th century women speculative fiction authors you would find, I think, would be, Le Guin and Octavia Butler. And then so many other influential authors, Hope Merleys, C.L. Moore, Lee Brackett, who wrote The Empire Strikes Back, by the way. No one talks about that. A woman wrote The Empire Strikes Back, or at least one draft of it. Joanna Russ, the GOAT, the best who ever did it. All of their books thrown into the trash heap of history, because even though people say, these days we care about women authors, they really don't. They are happy to let these excellent authors languish. And anyway, to end my rant, we need more attention, not just on Evangeline Walton, but on all of her contemporaries, right? However big or small they may have been in their moment, in their time frame. And I want a world where we get the end of that Theseus trilogy published, even if it's just an ebook. I just want her books released because the Mabinogion Quartet is so beautiful, but I really am viscerally angry that she is not given the due that she deserves. Anyway, thank you very much. Oh God, even if I edit this video down, it's still going to be impossibly long. Thank you very much for spending all this time for me. I hope you look into Evangeline Walton. At the current moment, it's relatively easy to find the classic paperbacks at different used bookstores because she was somewhat popular back in her revival in the 1970s. Otherwise, you can get the ebook from Amazon. It's just like the entire series in one file, though by all accounts that version has a ton of typos and whatnot that you would have to endure through, which again pisses me off that she's not given that due respect. If a single one of you checks out this series and enjoys it, then I've done my job. All right, take care. I love you.